Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part A. Introductory Chapters. Chapter 6. The Untold Story of the Conquest of the Land, shaping the character of Joshua, the cultic reform, and the Deuteronomic law of the ban. In many respects, the book of Joshua continues the book of Deuteronomy and is connected to it historically, narratively, and also by its Deuteronomistic ideology. Despite this connection and despite the clear continuity between the two books, Joshua is the first of the former prophet books, Nevi'im, in the Hebrew Bible. This is the introduction for the historiographic description of the history of Israel in Canaan, in which the story of the conquest of the land and its settlement is described. This understanding of the book of Joshua's historiographical place, alongside the emphasis on the importance of the law of the Torah and the presentation of loyalty to it as condition for the entire conquest, raises the question: did the school that stands behind the composition of the book of Joshua even intend to describe a historical reality? This problem is particularly difficult due to the totality that is repeatedly described in the book of Joshua, which is uncharacteristic of the later biblical descriptions, and according to which the conquest of the land was a total conquest, including the complete annihilation of all enemies, as described, for example, in the book of Joshua, chapter 10, verse 40, and I'm quoting. So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as Yahweh, the God of Israel, commanded. End of quote. The settlement, according to this description, was also complete and comprehensive in all parts of the country, and the summary of the settlement can be determined by the description in the book of Joshua, chapter 21, verses 43 to 45, and I'm quoting. Thus, Yahweh gave to Israel all the land which he swore to give to their fathers, and having taken possession of it, they settled there. And Yahweh gave them rest on every side, just as he swore to their fathers. Not one of all the enemies had withstood them, for Yahweh had given all the enemies into their hands. Not one of all the good promises which Yahweh had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. End of quote. There are serious historical and archaeological problems with this total and absolutist description. In terms of historical logic, it is unclear how, according to the biblical description, the semi-nomadic tribes of Israel, who had just emigrated from the margin of the desert, managed to deal with an enemy with a long military tradition and advanced technological knowledge. How could a poorly armed and untrained military prevail against a series of strong and fortified cities and well-trained forces, which included an intimidating cavalry corps? Moreover, contrary to the description in the book of Joshua, the archaeological research paints a picture of locals setting in the land throughout a gradual process, transitioning from a nomadic shepherd lifestyle to one focused on agricultural settlement. From an archaeological perspective, it is clear to us today that many of the sites that Joshua supposedly conquered, such Heshbon, Jericho, Ai, Hebron, Arad, or that are related to the conquering tradition, like Gibeon and Yarmut, were not inhabited at all on the eve of the supposedly period of the conquest and settlement. Indeed, by that point, some of them had been abandoned for many hundreds of years. Furthermore, from the historical archaeological reconstruction presented in previous chapters, it appears that the urban culture of the end of the Bronze Age in the land of Israel was destroyed and collapsed through a gradual process that spanned over a century and not in a single military campaign. The gap between the razing of various sites, such as Chatzor and Lachish, described in the book of Joshua, spans around 150 years and more. So clearly, they were not destroyed in a single military campaign. In addition, until the end of the 12th century BCE, there was a prominent Egyptian presence in the land, and the Canaanite cities were under the umbrella of Egyptian protection, which is entirely unmentioned in the description of the book of Joshua. Only with the Egyptian withdrawal from Canaan were some of the Canaanite cities on the coast and in the lowlands gradually destroyed. But it seems that the destruction had absolutely nothing to do with the consolidation of the tribes of Israel in the central hill country. Most of this area, which according to both the biblical description and the archaeological findings was the central settlement area, was uninhabited during this period, with only a very small number of fortified cities and no barrier preventing the settler tribes from settling within this region. The conclusion arising from this is that the tale of the conquest of the land, as described in the book of Joshua, holds no historical validity. But the question is whether this conquest is the main theme of the book at all, and whether this description was originally intended to convey a reliable historical picture that was supposed to accurately describe the ancient reality. From a broad perspective on the book of Joshua, we can see that of the 24 chapters in the book, the first 5 chapters include the description of Joshua's appointment and the conditional divine promise to conquer the land. This is chapter 1. The story of the spies and the story of Rahav. This is chapter 2. And a description of the crossing of the Jordan. This is chapter 3, 4, and 5. Chapters 13 to 21 include an account of the lands held by the tribes of Israel, and chapters 22 to 24 give the concluding speeches of the book. Only 5 of the book's 24 chapters discuss the story of the conquest. And even here, the only stories described in detail are the conquest of Jericho in chapter 6 and Ai, chapter 7 and 8. As we will see later, it is doubtful whether the story of the surrender of the Gibeonites in chapter 9 can be included within the stories of the conquest. But in any case, this story connects between the 2 detailed war stories and the schematic description of the war against the 5 kings of the south, chapter 10, an area that parallels the border of the historical kingdom of Judah, and the conquest of the entire northern region, chapter 11, an area that parallels the border of the historical kingdom of Israel. This broad perspective on the book of Joshua indicates that, first and foremost, it is a book offering a Deuteronomistic ideological message intended for the contemporaneous readers. It serves as another literary link in the sequence between the book of Deuteronomy and the historiographical description of the histories of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This message was created first and foremost due to the close connection and complete continuity between the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua, which is most clearly expressed in the shaping of the character of Joshua as the successor of Moses and as someone who is destined to carry out his instructions and fulfill the promises given to him. Therefore, the character of Joshua is shaped in two ways. On the one hand, as a military leader who leads the people to successful wars of conquest in the image of the kings of the ancient Near East, maybe also as a model to King Josiah, the king that the text was written in his time. And on the other hand, he is described as a religious leader who will succeed only if he follows the spirit of the book of Torah. That was found in the days of Josiah and is faithful to the commands of Moses as described, for example, in the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verses 7 to 9. This continuity between Moses and Joshua was nicely defined in the words of Rabbi Hanina in Bava Batra 75a. I'm quoting, "The face of Moses was as bright as the face of the sun. The face of Joshua was like the face of the moon." End of quote. These words indicate that Joshua's actions are modeled as a mirror image to Moses' actions. For example, the crossing of the Jordan mirrored the crossing of the Red Sea, as is explicitly stated in Joshua 4, verse 23, and I'm quoting, "For Yahweh, your God, dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as Yahweh, your God, did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over." End of quote. Following this, the revelation of the angel in Jericho, as described in the book of Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 to 15, mirrors God's revelation to Moses in the burning bush. And the description of Joshua's actions in the battle of Ai, as described in the chapter 8, verse 18, mirrors Moses' action in the war with Amalek, and I'm quoting Joshua chapter 8, verse 18. "Then Yahweh said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand towards Ai, for I will give it into your hand." And Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand towards the city. The transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua is the fulfillment of the words of Moses, which first take shape at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1 and then chapter 3, as well as at the end, chapter 31. The transfer of leadership between Moses and Joshua happens alongside the death of Moses, especially as described in the book of Deuteronomy 34, verse 9. I'm quoting, "And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as Yahweh has commanded Moses." End of quote. It continues in the book of Joshua when the description at the beginning of the book, it starts in chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, and I'm quoting, "After the days of Moses, the servant of Yahweh, Yahweh said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses, minister, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all these people, into the land which I am giving to them, to the people of Israel." End of quote. Regarding the fulfillment of the divine promise to Moses in the days of Joshua, the continuation of the opening of the book of Joshua in chapter 1, verses 3 to 6, determines that God promises, and I'm quoting, "Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, For you shall cause these people to inherit the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. End of quote. In terms of loyalty to Moses, to Mosaic law, and the importance of the book of Deuteronomy as a condition for the success of the conquest process, in the description at the end of the opening of the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verses 7 to 9, God also warns, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Be not frightened, neither be dismayed, for Yahweh your God is with you wherever you go. End of quote. The summary of the conquest of the land in Joshua 11 also emphasizes the connection to Deuteronomy as well as the continuity between Moses and Joshua, and this is in chapter 11 verses 15 to 18. As Yahweh had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that Yahweh had commanded Moses. So Joshua took all that land. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. End of quote. The summary of the conquest in verse 23 sums up this sequence very well in chapter 11 verse 23. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that Yahweh had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. End of quote. The connection between the books of Joshua and Deuteronomy is expressed mainly in the first part of the book of Joshua, which includes the story of the conquest of the land. There, except for chapter 1, which is an entirely Deuteronomistic introduction, speeches that express this ideology are interspersed, including the central part of Rahab's speech in chapter 2, where she quotes from the promises to Moses and from Moses' words in the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua's speech before crossing the Jordan in chapter 3 is also a Deuteronomistic speech. Likewise, Deuteronomistic are the speeches and the explanations given during the crossing of the Jordan. This is in chapter 4, verses 12 to 24. And after the crossing in chapter 5, verse 1. The explanation of the covenant of the Israelites in chapter 5, verses 4 to 7. The summary of the conquest of Jericho, chapter 6, verses 26 to 27. The story of the construction of the altar on Mount Eival. This is chapter 8, verses 30 to 35. The speech of the Gibeonites and its results in chapter 9, 9 to 27, and so on. The main message conveyed in the war stories of the book of Joshua is the realization and illustration of Deuteronomic law of the ban, which appears in the laws of the war in Deuteronomy 20 verses 10 to 18, motivated by a desire to exaggerate Israel's need to separate from its neighbors to the point of instructing them to destroy them. Indeed, the law of the ban is unique, appearing only in the book of Deuteronomy, and its purpose is religious, forbidding the Israelites from learning the custom of the Gentiles to do according to all the abominable practices, and from worshipping the gods. Therefore, the Deuteronomic law of the ban applies to all Gentiles in Canaan and is an ideological commandment. This law ignores the historical reality described in the other historical books, which testify to the settlement of different population in the land of Israel and also in other parts of the book of Joshua, which mention the Canaanites who remained in the land that yet remains. In terms of the law, the stories of Rachav and her family and of the Gibeonites are the only exceptions specifically mentioned. Clearly, the ban was not an ideology that was implemented at any stage in the history of Israel and Judah, but rather a late utopian ideology, which is an extension and radicalization of the Deuteronomistic idea of the chosen people. However, in the spirit of this idea, the early part of the book of Joshua was designed with the intention to express the way in which the Israelites should behave regarding the Canaanites at a later period in the history of Judah, when the majority of the population in Judah was already considered Judean. The ancient people of Canaan were a story from the distant past, and there was no one to exterminate and no one to act against in accordance with this law. It is theoretical law. The Deuteronomistic law of the ban distinguishes between the peoples of Canaan and the distant cities, which are not within the settlement boundaries of the tribes of Israel, but which it is permissible to accept surrender and live alongside. If these cities do not surrender, then the commandment is to fight them, strike all males, and take away their spoils. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 to 14. However, the law defines that all of this is true only for cities that are not contained within the settlement boundaries of the tribes of Israel. In verse 15 it says, "Thus you shall do to all the cities which are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here." End of quote. On the other hand, the cities that lie within the territories of the tribes of Israel have no other option but a complete annihilation, so that their worship and faith do not affect the tribes of Israel and distance them from full loyalty to the God of Israel. In Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18, it's written, "But in the cities of these people that Yahweh your God gives you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, as Yahweh your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices which they have done in the service of their gods, and so to sin against Yahweh your God." If we add to these laws the law banning a city that was tempted to worshipping other gods, as described in Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 12 to 18, then this law includes the complete destruction of all the inhabitants of the city and everything in it, as well as burning all of the property. It shall be a heap forever. It shall not be built again. An examination of all the description of war in the book of Joshua shows that not only were they written by those who were well acquainted with Deuteronomic law of the ban, but they were written to demonstrate the different ways of implementing this law and the possible exceptions to this law. In the story of the conquest of Jericho in Joshua 6, the instructions given to the people are unequivocal, as we can see in verses 17 and 19, and accordingly, after the fall of the city walls, the implementation of these instructions is described, and I can read from verse 20 to 25. "And the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Then they utterly destroyed all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and asses, with the edge of the sword. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rachav, and this is the exception that we will talk about in a minute. The words that conclude the story clarify the exception permitted by law of the ban. But Rachav, the harlot, and the father's household, and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive, and she dwelt in Israel to this day, to the days of Josiah, the day of the Deuteronomist, because she did the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. In the next chapter, chapter 7, the defeat during the attempt to conquer Ai demonstrates what happens to those who defy the ban and what should be done in such a case. The story opens in verse 1 with, I'm quoting, "But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, son of Zerach, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of Yahweh burned against the people of Israel." The defeat is the direct result of this, and after the reasons for the defeat were revealed, the lesson is stated in verses 11 and 12. Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own stuff. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies because they have become a thing for destruction. I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. End of quote. Later, the instructions are given on how to define those responsible for the above, and the punishment of the guilty is clear, and I'm reading from verse 15. "And he who is taken with the devoted things shall be burned with fire, he and all that he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of Yahweh, and because he has done a shameful thing in Israel." End of quote. When Achan was captured, he was taken with all his family and property to the Achor Valley, and their end is unequivocal. And I'm reading from verses 25 and 26. "And all Israel stoned him with stones. They burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day." This is the time when the Israelites can conquer Ai, this is according to the description in chapter 8, and fulfill the law of the ban, and this is from, I'm reading from verses 26 to 28. "For Joshua didn't draw back his hand, with which he stretched out the javelin, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Only the cattle and the spoil of that city Israel took as their booty, according to the words of Yahweh, which he commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day." End of quote. Following this victory and the Gibeonites' fear of what is expected of them, they came to Joshua and the Israelites, and the speech they delivered indicates a deep familiarity with the Deuteronomic law of the ban. In order to receive the promise of enslavement and be excluded from the law of the ban, the Gibeonites pretend that they had come from afar and that they come in peace. And this is in Joshua 9, verses 9 to 11. They said to him, "From a very far country your servants have come, because of the name of Yahweh your God." And they continue, "And our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, "We are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us." End of quote. The agreement between Joshua and the Israelites to make an alliance with the Gibeonites was attained only based on the belief that they did indeed come from distant land. Later on, the king of Jerusalem's fear of the people of Israel and the organization of the alliance of the five kings of the south also stemmed from the fear that gripped him when he understood what lay in store for him. And this is in Joshua 10, verses 1 and 2. However, this didn't help him, since according to the continuation of the story, this was exactly the fate of all the five kings of the south. Moreover, according to the story in chapter 11, this was also the fate of the kings of the north. The conclusion of the entire conquest process described in the book of Joshua is briefly stated in Joshua 11, verses 19 and 20, according to which, and I'm quoting, "There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took all in battle. For it was Yahweh doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be utterly destroyed and should receive no mercy, but be exterminated, as Yahweh commanded Moses." End of quote. Knowing this, it seems quite understandable that the stories of the conquest in the book of Joshua were designed to express the application of the Deuteronomic law of the ban, to demonstrate how to treat the neighboring Canaanite nations, to explain the exceptions, to illustrate what happens to those who obey Deuteronomic law and what happens to those who do not obey it. Other aspects highlighted by the stories of the conquest are the extent to which the wars are God's wars, in which the order is always fixed. God gives the instructions to Joshua, Joshua gives them to the people go to war, God places the enemies into the hands of Joshua and into the hands of the people, and then the banning instructions are carried out. The conclusion, as stated explicitly, is because Yahweh, the God of Israel, fights for Israel. I read from Joshua 10, verse 42. As long as the Israelites fight for their God and obey his laws, he stands at the head of the camp and leads them to victory. This is the message conveyed in the book of Joshua. The conclusion from this is that the stories of the conquest in the book of Joshua were not written as history, but were intended to convey an ideological message in the spirit of the book of Deuteronomy, of Deuteronomic law, and above all, in the spirit of the law of the ban. In order to convey the Deuteronomist message, the story was written for the generation of those days, the days of King Josiah towards the end of the First Temple period, and the details that were worked into the stories correspond with the historical and archaeological reality of the late 7th century BCE. Many researchers have noted that the description of the borders of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin and the list of cities in Joshua 15 and 18 correspond well with the borders of Judah and the cities that existed in the kingdom in the days of Josiah. On the other hand, it seems that the list of the inheritance of the rest of the tribes, especially those in the northern, the far northern tribes, does not reflect any plausible reality. It is utopian list, likely written much later during post-exilic times during the Persian period. Moreover, the historical background and the military logic of the story of the conquest of the lowland region, as described in Joshua 10, was written apparently in the context of the memory of the path of the Assyrian military campaign against Judah in 701 BCE, the Sancherib campaign, the same track of the army. The detailed stories of the conquest, according to which Jericho and Hai and the Gibeon were conquered also mirror the northward expansion of Judah in the days of Josiah, when the borders of Judah expanded to include Jericho and Bethel, which had previously belonged to the kingdom of Israel until it was destroyed 100 years before, and when the Assyrians withdrew and Judah could expand a little bit more to the north. The lowlands also returned in the days of Josiah, becoming an important part of the economy and administration of Judah. Therefore, the story of the conquest of this area in particular corresponds to the reality of that time of King Josiah. Furthermore, the figure of Joshua was also apparently modeled based on the character of King Josiah. Not only is he described as a king, but according to the description in Joshua 8, verses 30 to 35, Joshua renewed the covenant just as Josiah did, according to the second book of Kings, chapter 23, verse 1 to 3. The connection to Josiah can be found even in the smallest of the details in the book of Joshua. Thus, for example, according to the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 22, verse 1, the origin of Josiah's mother is from a small place called Botzkat, a place mentioned in the entire Hebrew Bible only once more in the list of cities of Judah in Joshua 15, verse 39, as a place located near Lachish. From all this, we can conclude that the character of Josiah was what the writers had in mind as they were shaping the character, the fictional character of Joshua. During this period, Judah was freed from the yoke of Assyrian rule after about 100 years of enslavement. Josiah led a national line that resulted in a cultic reform, but also in the expansion of Judah's territory, the re-establishment of rule in the lowland, and the hope of turning the small kingdom into the successor of the great kingdom of Israel, which at that time had already stood in ruins for over 100 years, was the reason for all this description. The cultic reform was certainly part of this new national line. Another part was the book of Joshua, describing an idyllic ancient reality. The people of Israel in the distant past, united under the leadership of one leader, faithful to God's law in their Deuteronomic version, and as a reward for this faith, God fights their wars and grants them victories and control over all parts of the country. Through this description, the book justified not only Josiah's policy, but also the religious revolution he led. It is likely that the book of Joshua, in its early Deuteronomic version, which was composed in the days of Josiah as part of the historiographical composition, included the stories of the conquest and emphasized the Deuteronomic laws, chief among them the law of the ban, and the many links to Moses and the book of Deuteronomy. In my opinion, the early Deuteronomistic work of Joshua ended with a summary found in chapter 21, verses 43 and 45, and I'm quoting. Thus Yahweh gave to Israel all the land which he swore to give to their fathers, and having taken possession of it, they settled there. And Yahweh gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies has withstood them, for Yahweh had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the good promises which Yahweh had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. However, the writing and editing of the book of Joshua didn't end in the days of Josiah, on the eve of the destruction of the first temple. The editing and writing of additions to the book continued in the subsequent generations in a complex and gradual process, which included at least 2 additional chronological stages with changing ideological perspective. The second, concluding speech, in Joshua chapter 23 already reflects a late editing which takes into account the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of its population. There is a greater emphasis there on the biblical law and the necessity to observe the commandments of the Torah. The figure of Joshua is shaped more prominently there as a religious leader charged with faithfulness to the Torah. Many researchers date this edit to either the exilic period or even later to the post-exilic period. The third speech in Joshua 24 already reflects a broader perspective. It presents the history of Israel starting from the days of the patriarchs. It's familiar with the stories of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. And it seems that the addition of chapter 24 was intended to connect the book of Joshua to the broader framework of what we call the Pentateuch, the books already from Genesis to Kings, all the 9 books. This chapter seems to have been added together with the utopian tribal allotments of all the tribes of Israel, and it reflects the final editing stage of the book during the Persian period. Therefore, the story of the conquest of the land was an ideological story designed to convey the message of the Deuteronomists. It didn't seek to convince its contemporaries that this description reflects a historical reality. They knew the reality very well and understood that this story was intended to emphasize the demand that the chosen people separate themselves from their neighbors, the ancient people of Canaan. The shaping of the character of Joshua in this spirit of King of Josiah and in light of his character and the detailed stories of areas that had only recently become a part of the King of Judah emphasize the extent of which the stories of the conquest carry a topical ideological message for the contemporaries and are a part of the messages that were integrated into the cult reform of that time. In the following chapters, we will move from the general introduction that we just finished to more specific stories. We will discuss the untold stories about ancient Jerusalem, the one that existed before the conquest of the city by David and after him. The information that the authors had and lacked about these ancient periods, and the stories they created about these periods, which were also integrated into the Deuteronomistic historiographic work. See you in the next chapter.